Okay, folks, welcome to another session of PHI 215. We are continuing our unit on free will today. So, just to recap where we got last time around, we saw that the problem of free will is a challenge of reconciling determinism with our intuitions or ideas about personal freedom and choices. So the thought here would be, we often think of the universe as a deterministic thing, that when we think of the universe, we think that every particular event is the inevitable result of the laws of physics and the prior state of the universe. But then we also have intuitions about personal freedom and choices. So the thought there is that people are capable of making choices and that people are responsible for their actions. So we seem to have something like a conflict that emerges when we think about how determinism and our thinking about freedom and choice fit together. So there are different ways of solving this apparent paradox. One way to go at it, and a view that we looked at last time around, is called hard determinism. And that's the view that free will does not exist. When we think about determinism and how it relates to personal freedom, we say, well, determinism is true, so personal freedom can't be real. Right? So this is basically, this hard determinist view is the mixture of the view determinism plus the further view that a deterministic universe is conceptually incompatible with there being anything worth calling freedom or choice. We also saw a view called indeterminism last time. So this is the view that not every event is determined by preceding events and the laws of nature. So the thought here is that there are ways that the world might be, and that several ways that the world might be are genuinely possible. So the fact that there are multiple open possibilities is James's strategy of reconciling or solving this problem. So he gets rid of determinism. Now, these aren't the only two views. So we're going to work on a new view today. And this view is called Compatibilism. One of its big defenders is this guy right here, who we've already introduced ourselves to this semester, John Locke. So here's how compatibilism works. It's the view that even though our desires are determined, we can still act freely just so long as, one, we have the power to do what we want. So free actions are ones where we have power to do what we want, and nothing is preventing us from doing it. So you are free to get up and leave the room so long as you have power to do it. So you have a body that's capable of getting up and leaving the room, and there's nothing preventing you from doing it. So for example, no one's restraining or coercing you. Nobody's put a lock on the door or anything like that. So that way of thinking about it suggests that we have freedom just so long as we have the power to do what we want, and nobody's preventing us from doing what we want. So here's how Locke puts it. He says that though the preference of the mind be always determined, yet the person who has the power, in which alone consists the liberty to act or not act, so the power to act or not act, according to your preferences, is free. So just so long as you have the power to act or not act, that is, you have the internal capabilities and you also don't have any external impediments, that's sufficient for freedom. Now, this compatibilist approach to freedom basically says that free actions are the ones where the agent could have done otherwise. So we're saying that even though the universe is deterministic, compatibilists and incompatibilists both think that it needs to be the case that you could have done otherwise in order to have acted freely. Now, the question here is what we mean by could have done otherwise. How on earth can we say that you could have done otherwise if the universe is deterministic? Doesn't that seem weird? Well, here's how compatibilists explain themselves. They say that could do otherwise just means you would have been able to do something different if you had wanted to. And you could have done otherwise because you're free in the sense that if you had desired this different thing than what you actually did, nothing would have prevented you from doing it. So the thought here is that acting freely isn't about not being subject to the laws of nature. It's just that if you had a different desire, you could have done that instead. So you're free in the sense that if your desires were different, nothing would have prevented you from pursuing that different desire. So that's the sense in which you could have done otherwise. Now, there's something kind of interesting about this, because it says that even if a person's actions are completely predictable, right? Every time I go to a restaurant and pour a fountain drink, I'm going to get Diet Coke or Diet Pepsi if I must, right? Now, the idea here is that my actions are completely predictable, right? It's never going to be the case that I'm going to get Sprite, at least not for me, right? But the idea is that I'm still pouring myself Diet Coke freely because if I had wanted Sprite, I could have poured that. And if I had desired Sprite, nothing would have prevented me from doing so. So in this vein, even though my actions are completely predictable, on a compatibilist understanding of it, even though my desires are completely firm and predictable, that doesn't keep my choices from being free choices. So W.T. Stace gives us this defense of compatibilism. So Stace says that human actions, whether they're free or unfree, are part of nature. Human beings are animals, and we are subject to the laws of physics just as much as paper clips or rocks or anything else. He then points out that, even human behavior is part of nature on this view. So, what Stace finds interesting is that we can still distinguish between free actions and unfree actions in ordinary life and talk. So he says, here's how we distinguish them. A free action is one that's caused by desires or motives or some sort of internal psychological state of an agent's mind. So, we might think about choosing a brand of cereal at your grocery store, or maybe something like writing a philosophy paper. They are the explanation of why you did this certain thing. To compare, unfree acts are caused by physical forces or physical conditions outside the agent. So, for example, being arrested by police or lacking food. These are unfree actions. So if you leave a building, but only because the police dragged you out, that is not an example of leaving freely on your own accord. Okay, so what we're seeing for Stace is that free actions are the ones caused by desires, motives, or internal psychological states of the agent, whereas, the unfree actions are caused by things outside the agent. So if we use this approach, Stace tells us that if we define free acts as acts caused by the desires of an agent, then there's no good reason to deny that free actions exist, right? Because it's perfectly reasonable to believe that desires exist, and desires cause people to act all the time. So the way that Stace thinks about it, it's completely implausible to claim that there's no such thing as free will. We have a perfectly sensible working concept of free actions. But we get an interesting criticism of this compatibilist approach. So against this sort of view that Locke and Stace are giving us, William T. Rowe, who we've encountered already in this course, makes this suggestion. Well, compatibilists give us a theory of free action. But what they don't give us is a theory of free will, right? So what do they mean by this? They're saying that the compatibilist theory of freedom is what the difference between a free action and an unfree action is. So the difference between leaving a building because you wanted to get some fresh air and leaving the building because it was on fire, right? But what they haven't given us, according to Rowe's criticism, is they haven't given us a theory of free will. So here's how Rowe makes the argument against this compatibilist view that people like Locke and Stace have given us. So they claim, first, if compatibilism is true, then an agent who does what she wants without external constraints is acting freely. But it seems clear, at least to Rowe, that an agent can do what she wants without external constraints and still be unfree. So basically, what Rowe is saying here is that acting according to your will and having no external constraints is not sufficient. It's not a guarantee that we have the freedom that's worth caring about yet. So, on that grounds, compatibilism is false, right? So this is yet another instance of a modus tollens argument, right? If P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. So we want to get a little more support for this argument, so we can try to think through the thought experiment that Rowe gives us. So here is a look at that thought experiment. So the thought experiment says, suppose I use a special machine that prevents you from willing to get out of your chair. It's still possible for the agent to do what they want, right? So it's still possible that you've used this magical machine on me that makes me want to stay seated in the chair. And it's perfectly within my wherewithal and my abilities to continue to do what I want. Moreover, there's no external constraints on me, right? So it's not the case that the reason why I'm not getting out of my chair is, for instance, that I'm being strapped down into it, right? So there's no external constraints on my action. But it doesn't seem like this agent is free. If we're using a special machine to manipulate that agent's will. So the thought here is that freedom of the will is really this special ability to do otherwise. It's not just about being unconstrained or having causes of action that are internal to the agent, as Locke and Stace argued. Because, think about this. When we think about Rowe's case, it might seem like, it's implausible to think of, manipulation by an evil scientist as compatible with freedom, right? And the idea is, well, it seems like your desires are being manipulated, and that your desires aren't really your own, right? But then the thought is, well, isn't that the case in all sorts of situations? Isn't it the case that your preference for Diet Coke over Coke or Sprite isn't something that you really chose? It's just something that kind of happened to you. Whether you find yourself with a drug addiction, perhaps. Again, this is explained in terms of deterministic factors like genetics and certain experiences that you had no choice about. So the thought here is, if you think that a special machine influencing your will creates a problem for freedom, then all sorts of natural causes for your beliefs and desires are also going to be troubling for similar reasons. So, just to sum up for today, compatibilists believe that freedom is compatible with determinism. So if you're a compatibilist, you believe that human actions are part of the deterministic universe. So it could be that every event is the necessary result of the laws of nature. But we still believe that free actions could be a real thing, because there are some actions where, so long as people can act differently, in the sense of not being constrained, that they could act differently if their desires were different, then that's enough for freedom. So Stace pointed out to us that free actions are just the actions that are caused by psychological states internal to an agent. But then we also saw this criticism, right? This criticism says that compatibilism is false. And it's false, according to Rowe, because the ability to act without external constraint isn't sufficient to show that your will is free, that it's really up to you what you desire to do and what your choices are. And that is going to require that there be legitimately open options about what your will could be. And that's going to go directly against the view that we saw in Locke, which says that having a determined will, that is, a will that had to be the way that it turned out, is compatible with freedom. So that sort of gets us to perhaps the biggest debate in the free will problem, compatibilism versus incompatibilism, which is about the extent to which we need genuinely open options for alternative actions. So compatibilists like Locke and Stace think that it could be the case that it's completely determined what you do, but so long as you're not being forced to do something, and as long as your actions are caused by your own psychological states, your own desires, then you're free. But Rowe says you need to have genuinely open, indeterministic abilities to do or not do the thing. So that's going to sort of get us to the ultimate question. Whether you have control over your desires and will, if you think you need that kind of control for free will or for free action, then you're an incompatibilist. But if you deny that you need to have control over your desires and your will, then you're leaning towards compatibilism, as it was defended by Stace and Locke. So that's going to wrap it up for today. Next time, we're going to look at the unit on libertarian theories of free will. So, thanks, as always, for listening in, and don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions or concerns, and I will look forward to hearing what you have to say about this compatibilist approach to the free will problem. So, thanks everybody, take care, and I'll be in touch soon.